1 month. That's all it took. Just 30 days into his prison sentence, Robert Fisher, the man convicted of one of the most horrifying crimes in Rensselaer's history, was suddenly found dead behind bars. No warning, no clear explanation. A life that ended in a cell, and a file that looked more like a blackout than a record. Pages stamped, paragraphs hidden, key lines reduced to strips of ink. The officials spoke, but the answers didn't follow. In the space where facts should live, we were given silence, and a mystery that refuses to settle. And friends, before we dive into this painful but vital story, I need to ask for your help. Every like, every subscription, every share of this video is a chance for another child to live the safe and happy life they deserve. If you see YouTube's new hype button, please tap it. It's a simple way to strengthen this channel and amplify stories that matter. Share this video wherever you can, and drop your city and the time you're watching in the comments. I want to see where people are standing up to protect children. This story is about more than one tragedy. It's about all of us choosing to do better. Back to Fisher. His sudden death didn't close the book. It ripped out a chapter. Was it suicide? A calculated attack? Or something that happened in the shadows and was filed away just as quietly? When a case ends this abruptly, the public imagination fills in the blanks and the rumors multiply. But here's the hard part. None of that noise changes the one truth that matters most. Because Fisher's death is only the epilogue to a story that should never have existed. Before the cell doors, before the headlines, before the blacked-out pages, there was Josephina, 3 years old. A child who should have been safe at home, loved and protected. A child whose name deserves to be spoken with care. What happened to her wasn't just a crime. It was a fracture in a community's sense of trust. Bedep. It made neighbors look at familiar faces and ask unfamiliar questions. It made parents hold their kids a little tighter at bedtime. It made an entire city feel smaller, darker, quieter. Tonight, I'm going to walk you through what we know and what we don't. We'll trace the path from a devastated family to an arrest that seemed inevitable. From a courtroom where a sentence was handed down to a prison where the story took a final, sudden turn. We'll keep the details clear and the language careful. Because dignity matters, especially when the victim is a child. We won't sensationalize. We won't guess. We will follow the record where it leads and name the gaps when it doesn't. This is not an easy watch. It shouldn't be. But sometimes the stories that hurt are the ones that teach. They remind us how quickly trust can be abused, how vital it is to pay attention, and how justice can feel incomplete even when the gavel falls. To truly understand what happened, to see the whole arc instead of the headlines, we have to start at the end, with a death inside a prison. A report that says almost nothing, and a community left with questions. And then we rewind. Before we talk about investigations, courtrooms, or prison walls, we have to talk about Josephina, because this story, at its core, is not about the man who caused so much devastation. It's about a little girl who never had the chance to grow up, whose name should be remembered for her light rather than her tragedy. Josephina Cunningham was only 3 years old. Just imagine that for a moment. 3 years old. That's the age of discovery, of laughter over simple things, of endless why questions asked to any adult in sight. It's an age where the world feels safe, because the people around you make it safe. She was a child who deserved many more birthdays, many more mornings of cartoons and cereal, many more afternoons running in the yard with sticky fingers and shoes that never stayed tied. Her family called her Josie, a sweet nickname that suited her curious spirit. Friends and relatives said she was bright-eyed, always tugging on someone's hand to show them what she'd found. A bug, a toy, a flower, anything that sparked her little imagination. She had that boundless energy that only children have, the kind that fills a room, even when she wasn't speaking. Josie's world was small, as children's worlds often are. Her home, her mother, her toys, her bed. It didn't take much to make her happy. A favorite stuffed animal, a story at bedtime, a hug that made her feel safe. She was still learning words, still piecing together sentences, still figuring out how to express her feelings. And yet, even at 3, she already carried a spark, the kind of innocence that makes adults stop and remember what unfiltered joy looks like. When people in Rensselaer heard her name after the tragedy, what struck them hardest was her age, 3 years old. It's an age when a child can barely reach the doorknob, when their world depends entirely on the people who surround them. To think that someone could betray that trust in such a brutal way shook the entire community. The Gat, the Philidorese life, revolved around her, as most families with small children do. Anyone who's been around a toddler knows how much attention they demand. The constant chatter, the cries for help with shoes or toys, the laughter when they do something silly and want to be applauded for it. Josie was no different. She lit up her home in ways that only small children can. She was a granddaughter, a niece, a cousin. Her presence was woven into the fabric of family gatherings, where she would climb into laps, share bites of food she barely chewed, and fall asleep in the middle of the noise, trusting that she was safe. Neighbors remember seeing her outside on warm days, toddling along the sidewalk, chasing bubbles, or calling out when she saw a familiar face. There was nothing extraordinary about her, in the sense of fame or headlines. And that's exactly what made her loss so piercing. She was an ordinary child living an ordinary life, and that ordinariness was what made her so precious. When tragedy struck, and her name became attached to the worst kind of crime, it forced people to confront the painful truth. This wasn't a headline from somewhere far away. This wasn't a story that could be dismissed as something that happens out there. It happened here, in their city, to a little girl who had been part of their streets and sidewalks. That's why when we tell Josephina's story, we do it gently. Because she cannot speak for herself, it's on us to make sure her name isn't lost in the shadow of Robert Fisher's. She wasn't defined by that night, by what happened to her. She was defined by her laugh, her curiosity, her small joys, and her potential. Every child carries that, the possibility of a whole life ahead. And that's what makes her story so heartbreaking. She never got to start school. She never got to make friends on the playground, or tell her family what she wanted to be when she grew up. She never got to celebrate a 5th birthday with balloons and cake, or learn how to ride a bike, or have her first sleepover. Those are the milestones stolen from her. So when you hear the name Josephina or Josie, don't just think of the crime. Think of a little girl who loved the simplest things, who carried innocence in every step, who trusted the people around her to keep her safe. Think of her as the reason this story matters. Because at the heart of every true crime case, there's a victim whose voice deserves to be louder than the cruelty that ended their life. That's who Josephina was. And it's for her that we tell this story. By bringing you closer to Josie, to her laughter, her innocence, her small but meaningful life. I hope you feel her presence, because to understand the horror of what happened next, you first need to feel what was lost. To understand how this tragedy unfolded, we have to step into the life of the man at the center of it, Robert Fisher. At first glance, Fisher wasn't a stranger lurking in the shadows. He wasn't the kind of figure parents warned their children about in hushed tones. He was an insider, someone who had access to the household, someone trusted enough to be near Josephina. And that trust is what makes the betrayal so chilling. Robert Fisher was 34 years old at the time of the crime. He wasn't a man who stood out much in public, not the kind of person who made headlines before this case. To many who knew him, he seemed ordinary, unremarkable even. But beneath that surface were cracks that, in hindsight, look less like ordinary struggles and more like dangerous warning signs. Fisher had a history with drugs, a shadow that followed him for years. People who crossed paths with him described erratic behavior, the kind of instability that made you uneasy, but was easy enough to dismiss if you weren't looking too closely. He was known to take prescription medication, and not always in ways prescribed by a doctor. This habit, quiet and often overlooked, would later take on a darker role in the events of that summer night. What unsettles many when looking back is how close he was allowed to be to Josephina. This wasn't a stranger forcing his way in. This was a man who had been in the home before, who was familiar to the family, who carried the illusion of safety. Children, after all, are quick to trust the people their parents allow into their lives. Josie likely saw him not as a threat, but as another adult in her orbit. Someone ordinary, someone safe. But the truth was different. Behind the surface of that familiarity was a man unraveling. His life didn't follow a straight path, and those who observed him closely saw instability simmering under the surface. Unpredictable moods, strange decisions, and the creeping presence of addiction all painted the picture of someone struggling, someone capable of choices that most could never imagine making. As investigators would later reveal, Fisher's access to medication and his willingness to misuse it became central to this case. He wasn't just unstable, he was dangerous, and he had the means to act on impulses that should have never existed. And that's where the unease grows heavier. Because when the danger comes from outside, we know to lock the doors. But when it comes from the inside, from someone familiar, it's harder to see it coming until it's too late. Looking at the story now, it's impossible not to feel the tension building. A man with a fragile grip on stability. A household where trust was given. A little girl who saw only safety in the adults around her. Those three elements came together in a way that would devastate everyone connected to them. Robert Fisher wasn't the stranger in the dark. He was the trusted insider, the familiar face, the man who should never have been near Josephina. And it's that betrayal of trust that makes what happened next so hard to comprehend. July 6, 2023, began like any other summer day in Rensselaer, New York. The streets of the small city were calm. The warm air carried the familiar hum of a community winding down for the evening. And inside Josephina's home, there was no sense of the storm about to break. For her family, it was another ordinary night. For Robert Fisher, it became the night that would expose the darkest parts of his character and forever alter the lives of everyone who knew him. According to investigators, Fisher had been in and around the household often enough that his presence didn't raise alarm. He wasn't a stranger arriving out of nowhere. He was part of the circle allowed inside. That trust gave him an opening, and on that July night he acted on it. What he did was calculated. Prosecutors later revealed that he had access to medication belonging to Josephina's mother, and he used it not for himself, but against the child. The toxicology report would eventually tell the story. Traces of prescription medication found in Josephina's small body. Investigators believe Fisher sedated her, rendering her vulnerable, unable to resist or even cry out. It was this act, the deliberate decision to drug a defenseless 3-year-old, that marked the beginning of the crime. It was not random. It was intentional. And it changed everything that followed. Once Josephina was unconscious, the rest of the events unfolded with horrifying speed. The details that prosecutors shared in court were clinical, stripped of unnecessary description, but chilling all the same. Fisher assaulted her and then, in what investigators believe was a desperate attempt to avoid discovery, he ended her life. To cover his tracks, he attempted to clean her body, using items found in the home, including Clorox wipes. He thought he could erase the evidence, remove the traces, and perhaps even deflect suspicion. But by the early hours of July 7th, Josephina was gone, a life extinguished before sunrise. Fisher, meanwhile, left behind a scene that carried both his actions and his mistakes. Investigators would later point to the inconsistencies in his behavior that night and the physical evidence that no amount of frantic cleaning could remove. Forensic teams would discover the remnants of medication in Josephina's system, the telltale signs that she had been drugged. They would find traces of the wipes, the attempt to sanitize what could never truly be hidden. And they would piece together a timeline that made clear the role Fisher played. Every effort he made to conceal his crime only deepened the trail of evidence that pointed directly back to him. But in that moment, in those silent, terrible hours between July 6th and 7th, Fisher must have thought he could get away with it. That belief, that arrogance, became part of the story too. Because when the police arrived later, when Josephina's family found themselves in the unimaginable position of reporting the loss of a child, suspicion fell quickly on the man who had been close, the man who had opportunity, and the man whose behavior was suddenly under a microscope. The community didn't know the details yet. They only knew that a child was gone, and that something deeply wrong had happened in their midst. But behind the closed doors of the investigation, the timeline was already being reconstructed, each piece of evidence adding to the weight pressing down on Robert Fisher. It's easy now, with hindsight, to look at the pieces and see how the picture came together. But, in the days immediately after Josephina's death, it was a puzzle with missing parts, and law enforcement was racing against time to make sense of it. They had a child's body with signs of medication. They had a man who seemed to know too much and clean up too carefully. And they had the instincts that told them this was no accident. Meta. Sex 0.05. And here's where the story turns. Because as Fisher thought he could erase his crime, investigators were already closing in. The question wasn't if he would be caught, but how quickly the truth would reveal itself. The morning of July 7, 2023, shattered a family's world. What began as another summer day in Rensselaer quickly turned into a scene of devastation that no parent, no grandparent, no relative should ever have to witness. Josephina's small body was found lifeless inside her home. In an instant, everything changed. The discovery was a moment of disbelief. Families who lose a loved one often describe the first minutes as surreal, as if their minds refuse to accept what their eyes are seeing. For Josephina's family, the weight of reality settled with a crushing finality. Their 3-year-old, their little girl with bright eyes and boundless curiosity, was gone. The silence in the house was unbearable. A space that had once echoed with the sounds of a child's laughter was now filled with a grief so heavy it seemed to press against the walls. News of the tragedy spread quickly, as it often does in smaller communities. Rensselaer is not the kind of place where headlines usually scream of murder, let alone the murder of a child. Neighbors whispered, phones rang, and within hours, disbelief gave way to anger. Parents held their children tighter that day. Friends exchanged worried glances, asking the same question over and over. How could this happen here? Community members brought flowers, stuffed animals, and candles to the family's home. A makeshift memorial grew on the sidewalk, a silent testimony to the collective grief. Strangers wept for a child they may not have known personally, but who felt like their own. because Josephina could have been anyone's daughter, anyone's niece, anyone's grandchild. The innocence of her age cut through every social barrier. She was 3, just 3. And that fact alone ignited a fire of outrage that spread through the city. Law enforcement, meanwhile, had little time to pause for grief. Detectives entered the house, studying the scene with trained eyes. They collected evidence, the medication, the cleaning supplies, the subtle signs that told a story of deliberate harm and attempted concealment. They looked not only at what was present, but at what was missing. Josephina had not simply died in her sleep. There were no signs of accident, no natural cause. What they saw pointed in another direction, and suspicion quickly settled on Robert Fisher. Fisher's behavior in those first critical hours didn't help him. According to reports, his demeanor was off. Investigators noticed inconsistencies in his account of the night, small cracks in the story he tried to tell. His attempt to clean up the crime scene only raised more questions. Why would a man with no reason to be involved act with such urgency? Why would he touch what he shouldn't? Each misstep tightened the noose around him. To the outside world, the shock of Josephina's death dominated every conversation. To the investigators behind closed doors, the case was narrowing with speed. They weren't chasing an unknown suspect. They were circling in on the man who had opportunity, access, and evidence stacked against him. Fisher had underestimated the power of forensics and overestimated his ability to cover his tracks. For the community, though, all that mattered in those first days was loss. Parents, who once left their doors unlocked, began double-checking the bolts at night. Conversations at grocery stores and churches began with the same question. Why? Why would anyone do this? Why would a grown man target a defenseless child? And why hadn't anyone seen it coming? Grief and disbelief blended into rage. Fisher was not an outsider to them. He had been trusted. That betrayal cut deeper than any headline could capture. It wasn't just that a crime had been committed. It was that a child's innocence had been destroyed by someone who never should have been allowed near her in the first place. And so, even as the family mourned and the community searched for answers, law enforcement was already building their case. The grief was overwhelming, but beneath it, a quiet determination grew. Justice had to come swiftly. And Robert Fisher, the man who thought he could hide his crime, was about to find himself at the center of an investigation he couldn't escape. By the time investigators finished combing through Josephina's home, the tragedy had already taken on a sharper shape. What had first appeared as a sudden, inexplicable loss now carried the unmistakable hallmarks of a crime. The pieces of evidence collected in those crucial first hours began to form a picture, one that pointed directly at Robert Fisher. The toxicology report was one of the earliest breakthroughs. Medical examiners discovered prescription medication in Josephina's small body, drugs that had not been prescribed to her. It was an alarming find, not only because of the unnatural presence of the drugs, but also because of where investigators quickly traced them. The pills matched prescriptions belonging to Josephina's mother. This meant someone had deliberately administered the medication, and the immediate suspect was the man who had access to both the home and the child that night, Robert Fisher. Then came the signs of a cover-up. Investigators noted the unusual use of cleaning products around Josephina's body. Clorox wipes had been used in an attempt to erase evidence, but the effort was sloppy. Wipes can remove surface traces, but they rarely eliminate forensic proof completely. Swabs collected from the scene revealed residual substances and DNA, all of which contradicted any claim of innocence. For the investigators, this wasn't just evidence of a crime. It was evidence of intent. Fisher hadn't stumbled into a tragic accident. He had tried to clean up what he had done. Fisher's behavior in the aftermath added to the suspicion. Those who saw him that morning described his demeanor as detached, uneasy, even evasive. Instead of shock and grief, there was something off, a nervousness, a lack of consistency in his account. When questioned, his story shifted in small but telling ways, raising red flags for detectives. People react differently to tragedy, but Fisher's reactions didn't align with a grieving bystander. They aligned with someone trying meta, sex's 0.05, and failing to manage a story that wouldn't hold. As the weight of evidence mounted, law enforcement moved quickly. Within days of Josephina's death, police arrested Robert Fisher. The arrest itself was a decisive moment, a clear signal to the family and the community that the investigation was not stalling, that justice was actively being pursued. Visitants, neighbors watched as Fisher was taken into custody. The sight of him in handcuffs both shocking and strangely relieving. There was fear, yes, but there was also a sense that the system was moving toward accountability. Once in custody, Fisher faced formal charges that reflected the severity of the crime. Prosecutors charged him with second-degree murder and first-degree rape. The language was stark and clinical, but the implications were devastating. Second-degree murder carried the weight of a life taken with intent, while first-degree rape underscored the violation that made this crime especially heinous. Together, the charges painted a picture of a man who had not only betrayed the trust placed in him, but had also committed acts of unspeakable violence against a defenseless child. For the community, hearing those charges announced was both painful and necessary. Painful because it confirmed what many feared, that Josephina's death was not an accident, but the result of deliberate cruelty. Necessary because putting Fisher's crimes into words was the first step toward holding him accountable. Court documents, news reports, and press briefings repeated those charges again and again, each repetition hammering home the gravity of what had been done. Behind the scenes, prosecutors prepared for what they knew would be a grueling process. Building a case in crimes involving children requires precision and care. Every piece of evidence had to be airtight, every report meticulous, every statement consistent. The toxicology results, the cleaning attempts, the inconsistencies in Fisher's story, all of it became part of the foundation for a prosecution that would not waver. For Josephina's family, the arrest was bittersweet. On one hand, there was some comfort in knowing that the man responsible was behind bars. On the other, no arrest, no charge, no trial. could bring back the little girl they had lost. Justice was important, but it could never fill the silence left in her absence. Still, seeing Fisher in custody meant that the system was acknowledging their pain and promising to seek accountability. Meta, sex 0.05, confirmed in labs and delivered in courtrooms. The arrest marked a turning point. The private grief of a family was now a public fight for justice. And as Fisher awaited his day in court, the community braced itself for the next chapter, the trial that would lay bare the full weight of his crimes. The courthouse in Rensselaer County was heavy with silence on the day Robert Fisher faced his reckoning. By then, months had passed since Josephina's death, but the wound in the community had not closed. Families still spoke her name in whispers. Neighbors still left flowers outside the home where her laughter had once filled the air. And Josephina's relatives walked through each day with an emptiness that could not be put into words. Justice was coming. But for them, justice could never mean restoration. Robert Fisher entered the courtroom no longer the familiar face once welcomed into a family's home. He was now the accused, the man whose name had become synonymous with betrayal, cruelty, and a crime that shook everyone who heard it. He looked smaller somehow, stripped of the arrogance he had once carried, seated at the defense table in standard prison garb, waiting for the system to pass judgment. The charges against him were monumental: second-degree murder and first-degree rape. Crimes so severe they carried the weight of decades behind bars. The prosecution laid out their case with precision. Each word chosen not to inflame, but to establish. They spoke of the toxicology report that revealed Josephina had been drugged. They spoke of the cleaning attempts, the Clorox wipes, the hurried efforts to erase the truth. They spoke of the contradictions in Fisher's story and the overwhelming weight of forensic evidence that tied him to the crime. But as strong as the case was, the trial never reached its full dramatic arc. Instead, Fisher took a plea deal. He pled guilty to both charges, a move that stunned some and angered others. For the prosecutors, it was a decision that ensured Fisher would spend decades in prison, without the uncertainty of a drawn-out trial. For the family, though, it felt complicated. On one hand, there would be no painful testimony, no cross-examination that forced them to relive. A plea deal robbed them of the chance to hear a full trial, to see every piece of evidence laid out before the world. The sentence was delivered. 20 years to life. A number that, to the public, felt both immense and inadequate. 20 years guaranteed, with the possibility of more. 20 years during which Fisher would sit behind bars, away from children, away from freedom. Yet for Josephina's family, no number could balance the scale. She had lost not 20 years, but an entire lifetime. The milestones she would never reach, the birthdays she would never celebrate, the laughter the family would never hear again, all of it weighed heavier than any prison sentence could, When the judge read the sentence, the courtroom was still. Reporters scribbled in notepads, family members clutched tissues, and Fisher sat expressionless. Some said he showed no remorse. Others believed he had resigned himself to his fate. What was clear, though, was that the system had spoken. He was guilty. He would serve his time. For the community, the plea and sentencing marked a moment of closure. Parents who had followed the case from the very beginning felt a measure of reassurance. They could tell their children that the man responsible for Josephina's death was no longer walking free. They could begin, however slowly, to let the weight of fear lift from their shoulders. But closure is not the same as healing. For Josephina's family, the pain was raw and unending. They sat in that courtroom, listening to the legal language of guilt and sentencing. But what they heard most was silence. The silence of a little girl who should have been there, alive, growing, and loved. Their heartbreak was immeasurable, their grief unrelenting. In the days that followed, the headlines repeated the same phrases: plea deal accepted, sentenced to 20 years to life, justice for Josephina. But beneath the print, beneath the broadcasts, there was the unspoken truth. Justice in this case would always feel incomplete. It had to be, because nothing could undo what had been done. And yet, just when the community thought the story had reached its end, with Fisher behind bars and a sentence delivered, a shocking twist was waiting. A twist that would reopen questions, stir speculation, because only a month into his sentence, Robert Fisher would be found dead in his cell. When the gavel fell and Robert Fisher was sentenced to 20 years to life, many believed the story had reached its final chapter. Josephina's family left the courtroom with broken hearts, but also with the faint comfort that the man who took their little girl from them would never again walk freely among children. The community, though still grieving, felt a fragile sense of closure. Justice, while imperfect, had been delivered. But then, only a month later, a shocking twist shattered that fragile balance. Robert Fisher was dead. He had barely begun serving his sentence at Elmira Correctional Facility, a maximum security prison in upstate New York, when word spread that he had been found lifeless in his cell. The news came quickly, but the details did not. Official reports were released in fragments, riddled with black bars of redaction. Entire paragraphs were obscured. Key details were missing. What remained was little more than a skeleton of information. A note confirming his death, but leaving every important question unanswered. The public was left with speculation. Was Fisher's death the result of suicide? Had the weight of his crimes, the public hatred, and the isolation of prison driven him to end his own life? Or was it something else entirely? In maximum security prisons, crimes against children carry a stigma even among the incarcerated. Inmates who harm children are often singled out, harassed, or attacked. Could Fisher have been targeted? Was this prison justice? Retaliation by those who despised his crimes. The silence from officials only fueled the rumors. Reporters requested documents, families demanded answers, and citizens speculated in online forums. But what they received instead of clarity were heavily redacted reports. Critical information about the circumstances of Fisher's death was withheld. The autopsy results weren't made public, and the few statements issued by prison authorities were deliberately vague. The official narrative seemed designed to end questions, not answer them. And that silence was deafening. For Josephina's family, the news stirred conflicting emotions. On one hand, Fisher's death meant he would never again see freedom. He would never appeal his sentence, never step outside prison walls, never live to old age. In that sense, his death was final. But it also robbed the family of something important: the long, grinding accountability of prison time. They had expected him to live with his guilt, to endure decades of confinement. His death cut that short, leaving them with a strange and unsettling emptiness. Justice had been promised in years, but it had ended in weeks. The community's reaction mirrored that conflict. Some felt relief that Fisher was gone, believing that whatever the cause, the result was fitting. Others felt cheated, as though the system had withheld the truth. Was his death truly natural? Was it suicide? Or had prison officials looked the other way while other inmates exacted their own revenge? Without answers, every theory seemed possible. What unsettled people most was the secrecy. Why redact so much? Why shield the circumstances from public view? In a case that had already devastated trust, the refusal to disclose the truth about Fisher's death only deepened suspicion. It left lingering questions, not just about him, but about the system itself. If officials would not reveal what happened to a convicted child killer, what else might they keep hidden? The unanswered questions became the story. Fisher was gone, but his death left behind a vacuum filled with speculation and doubt. In the end, the public was left with shadows. A man convicted of an unforgivable crime, sentenced to decades behind bars, and gone within weeks. And so, the mystery lingers. Was Robert Fisher dead? We may never know for certain, but what we do know is this. The secrecy surrounding his death leaves us with one haunting question. If this is what happens to someone under maximum security, how much do we really know about what goes on behind those prison walls? Robert Fisher's death was supposed to mark the end of a dark story, but instead it opened a new chapter filled with silence and suspicion. Officials confirmed the fact of his passing, but withheld nearly everything else. Pages of documents were blacked out. The cause of death was not released. Even the coroner's report, usually a public record, was tucked away from view. For a community already shaken by the loss of a child, this secrecy felt like another betrayal. Why hide the truth? Was it to protect an ongoing investigation, or to shield the prison system from scrutiny? When institutions choose silence, it often raises more questions than answers. If Fisher had taken his own life, why not say so plainly? If he had been attacked by another inmate, why not confirm it? And if his death had been the result of negligence or misconduct, then the silence becomes even more troubling. What the redactions suggest is that the story behind those walls may not align with the official narrative. In maximum security prisons, justice sometimes plays out beyond the courtroom. Inmates who commit crimes against children are often singled out, their very presence a trigger for violence. Could Fisher's death have been an act of retaliation, a kind of prison justice carried out in the shadows? Or was it something more mundane? A suicide driven by guilt and despair. Without transparency, the truth remains locked away. The bigger question is about accountability. If the prison system cannot provide clarity in a case this high profile, what does that mean for the countless cases the public never hears about? How many deaths behind bars go unexamined, quietly explained away, their details hidden under layers of redaction? Josephina's case was already about broken trust, a man who abused the access he was given. With that, the figure released her and disappeared into the draft of his own hand, while you think really happened inside Elmira prison. Share your thoughts in the comments, because the silence of the officials leaves only one thing: our speculation. As the headlines faded and the case file closed, what remained was not Robert Fisher's name nor the mystery of his death, but the memory of a little girl whose life was cut short. Josephina, Josie, deserves to be remembered not for the crime committed against her, but for the brightness she brought to her family in the few years she had. She was 3 years old, curious, playful, and full of laughter. That light, though stolen too soon, should be the focus when we speak her name. Every tragedy carries lessons, and Josephina's story is no different. It reminds us that the greatest responsibility any community has is to protect its children. They are the most vulnerable among us, dependent on adults for safety, guidance, and care. When that trust is broken, the damage ripples far beyond a single family. It shakes neighborhoods, schools, and entire cities. Josephina's death made Rensselaer confront that truth in the harshest way possible. Justice, in this case, was imperfect. A plea deal, a sentence, and then a sudden death in prison left many questions unresolved. Yet even within that imperfection, the pursuit of accountability mattered. It showed that Josephina's life had value, that what was done to her would not be ignored or dismissed. For her family, it was not enough. It never could be. But it was something. Her legacy should not be just the reminder of what was lost, but also the call to do better. To be vigilant about who we trust around children, to pay attention to warning signs we might otherwise overlook, to demand transparency from systems that are supposed to protect us, because protecting children is not only a family's duty, it is a community's collective promise. So as we close this chapter, let Josephina's name stay with you, not as a headline, but as a reminder of innocence, of the urgency of vigilance, and of the responsibility we all share. And as you carry that with you, remember, this story isn't just about tragedy. Sex that about what we choose to do in the aftermath, and how we honor the ones who should still be here. And that brings us to the end of Josephina's story. A story that began with innocence, was marred by betrayal, and ended with more questions than answers. Her life deserves to be remembered, and her memory should remind us of what matters most: protecting children, demanding justice, and holding systems accountable. But friends, stories like this are not easy to tell, and they're not easy to hear. They force us to confront the darkest parts of human nature and the failures that allow tragedy to happen. Yet, they must be told, because silence does nothing to protect the vulnerable. Every time we speak Josephina's name, every time we reflect on her short life, we honor her and shine a light where darkness tried to take hold. So, if you believe stories like this need to be told with honesty and respect, I invite you to join me. Hit subscribe, tap that notification bell, and be here for the next case. Because these stories matter, and together we can make sure they're not forgotten. Every like, every share, every comment helps amplify the voices of victims who can't speak for themselves. And now I want to hear from you. Robert Fisher's death in prison remains wrapped in secrecy, with more redactions than revelations. Do you think it was suicide? Retaliation by other inmates? Or something officials don't want us to know? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'll be reading every one. This isn't just about one story. It's about building a community that refuses to look away. So, add your voice, stay connected, and remember Josephina. Because her story deserves more than silence.